Good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Sarah Zenaida Gould, and I'm the Executive Director of the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute. Tonight, we're going to learn about Latinos in the crossroads of America, Indiana, which is home to nearly 500,000 Latinos. Tonight, we're going to be learning about those Latinos from the authors of this recent book, Hoosier Latinos, A Century of Struggle, Service, and Success. So we have the authors with us tonight, Nicole Martinez-LeGrand and Daniel Gonzales. Nicole is the Multicultural Collections Curator at the Indiana Historical Society. And Danny was formerly the Director of Exhibitions Research at the Indiana Historical Society, but now he's at the famous Indiana Children's Museum. Well, welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I want to just make sure, I know we have a slideshow that you're going to show tonight, but
Yeah.
I was just wondering if before we got started and before we hop into this, are the two of you native of Indiana?
I am. My family has been calling Indiana home for 100 years. And so my family was part of the early enclave that formed in Northwest Indiana, which I will tell you all about.
Okay.
Yeah. So, yeah, native.
Wonderful.
Danny.
And I was born in Manhattan, Kansas, but I moved to Indiana to the Indianapolis area when I was like 3 years old. So I think I can safely say I'm a Hoosier.
Mhm.
Wonderful. Well, that's just so interesting. Okay, well, I want us to hop into it then. And so I'm going to put your slides up. And just as a reminder to our guests, if you do have questions for our speakers tonight, you can drop those in the chat and we'll try to get to those at the end.
All right, so we're talking about Hoosier Latinos, a century of struggle, service, and success. All right, Sarah, next slide. And so, where did it all start? So, the Indiana Historical Society was founded in 1830, so roughly about 15 years after Indiana earned its statehood. So, a large bulk of our collection is related to the Northwest Territory, which is pre-statehood history, and statehood history. In 2016, 186, 87 years later, I was hired by the Indiana Historical Society to fill in a gap in their collection, something that they didn't really have strong subject matter on, which is specifically the Latino and Asian population of Indiana. And so today we're talking about my research with the Latinos of Indiana. And then I started to spearhead and continue to spearhead their multicultural collecting initiative. So from 2016 to 2018, I did a lot of field work, traveling across the state, creating new relationships, strengthening existing relationships to build a robust research collection. And then in 2017 and 2018, we launched the Latino and Hispanic digital collection. So just showing maybe roughly a third of some of the items that I collected through my travels through the state. Next slide. So again, with my field work, what kind of information, how do I collect it? How do I build a collection? Well, primarily I did that by conducting oral history interviews. So here are my tools. And so it was just a digital recorder, again, and some various paperwork. And this is what I carried with me throughout the state. So as a vehicle to build the collection, the oral history served as, content, but I also asked my interviewees to help us build this by presenting photos, to bring them to their interview to help recall some memories or to talk about certain family members. And so those photos were loaned to us or given to us and are added to our digital collection. So again, earlier at the start of this program, they asked me, are we native to Indiana? And I am. And so here are my great grandparents with my teenage great grandmother who settled in Northwest Indiana in 1923. Next slide.
So in 2018, I mentioned it before that I grew up in Indiana. In 2008, I moved out to St. Louis and spent time living out there. And one of the tasks that I sort of endeavored into is exploring the Mexican and Mexican American community in the St. Louis region. So when I arrived back in Indianapolis in 2018 to take over this position at the Indiana Historical Society, I got to join Nicole there just on sort of the brink of efforts to take all of this incredible documentation that Nicole had gathered over several years and find ways to interpret it and to put it into a form where we could start to educate the public, folks who maybe didn't know this full story, which we found out were a lot of folks, to educate them about what this story was. And it was a big story. I mean, Nicole found these, incredible resources. There was a much deeper history than a lot of people realized. And we just wanted to find some really incredible ways to synthesize what was a huge story into a digestible way of introducing people who weren't familiar to it. And what turned out to be a small gallery initially, and we found new and larger ways to tell these stories as time went on. So you can see sort of the timeline here. 2018, we put together the initial exhibition, Be Heard Latino Experiences in Indiana. In 2019, we received funding for a number of projects that would take place over the years that would follow. It included funding for a traveling exhibition, and I'm going to talk more about each of these a little bit as we go along here. A book that was mentioned at the beginning of this, as well as an online exhibition. And the online exhibition was a really great opportunity for us to take this content that was in exhibitions in a physical space and make it accessible across geographies, as well as make it last longer than perhaps the duration of some of these exhibitions were. Finally, an education guide was commissioned and eventually released in 2022. So we can go to the next slide here. So this is a photograph from opening night of the Be Heard Latino Experiences in Indiana exhibition. You can see sort of some of the gallery space. It incorporated photography, some artifacts that had been collected, but sort of the core of this, what drove this exhibition, were the oral history interviews that Nicole had done. We were pulling clips from those interviews that touched on the key themes and periods that we really wanted to talk about. And those themes included exploring the immigration experience. They included the formation of community, included the sort of exploration of work and labor that was so central to the Latino experience in Indiana, and also included a look at the sort of social impact and political impact that Latinos had on the state of Indiana. We can jump to the next slide here. So we kind of organized this, 100 years of history into 4 major periods. We wanted to look at the founding of the community, which Nicole's going to talk a lot about here in just a moment. Going into the post, Great Depression era, there was a lot of growth, but it was a period with a lot of hurdles. So we called this sort of the era of tumultuous growth. Third era, sort of starting in the post-war era, and really looking at the 1960s, 70s, and early 80s, was a period that we called gaining visibility and power. It was an era where, some of the first elected officials from the Latino community gained office. It was a period of a lot of activism and just generally increased visibility for the Latino community, which came about for a lot of reasons. And finally, looking at the modern era, sort of 1980, the 90s to the present, a new era of growth, diversity, and advocacy. So we organized into these general 4 periods. And, Nicole and I talked back and forth about these divisions. We recognized that there were limitations to this kind of, delineation, that these eras overlapped with one another in really dramatic and important ways. But for the exhibition, for, the sort of structure that the exhibits take, providing these key points, these key periods, became really, really important and really helpful in sort of structuring the story that we wanted to tell. So we can go to the next slide here. So I mentioned that we put together an online exhibit. This was part of a larger project. In 2019, we opened experiences on a project called Groundbreaking Black Hoosiers. And so this was an opportunity for us to combine that series into multiple online exhibits. A key one, and the first one, was this Be Her Latino experiences. And in it, we can go to the next slide here. This is sort of the landing page. If we go to the next slide, we can see sort of how we structured the site. It included, again, those core interview clips that really drove this story home and connected it with real Hoosiers and their real experiences. We can jump to the next slide here. And the next stage was we put together a traveling exhibition. This was a smaller footprint, but by this point, I think we had sort of distilled the message of what we wanted to talk about a little bit more. And it was an opportunity for us to take this story out of central Indiana and provide an opportunity for folks around the state to learn about these stories, and to experience them outside of the Indiana History Center, which has limitations to access for a variety of reasons. So this was 16 panels. It was designed so that it could be freestanding. It was designed so that it could be put into a variety of spaces, adjusted for size and scope. It was a really great tool for us to take this story and move it into different avenues, as was the online exhibition. So we can go to the next slide here. The sort of culmination of all this work came in 2020 as we started work on this book. And Nicole and I sort of, spent, I think while a lot of folks were, in the midst of COVID and dealing with a whole lot of different things, we found ourselves sort of sitting on our couches, talking to each other on Zoom and on the phone, trying to figure out how to take all of these stories, expand them a little bit, tell them in a broader way, but also sort of recognize where we had limitations and what we wanted this book to really accomplish. It was stressful, and it was a quick process in a lot of ways, but I think we're both really happy with the outcome, and it's been really great to see sort of the reception and how people have been able to use this, particularly for me, and I think, Nicole, you probably agree, it's been really gratifying to see it accompanied with the educational curriculum and incorporated into things that folks are doing in our school system in Indiana and telling that story, so that young people have access to it. So I will turn it back over to Nicole, I think, for the next slide. Nope,
Right.
I'm sorry. I'm going to continue on.
No,
We'll go to the next slide here.
Joke's on you.
Yeah, I'm going to keep talking.
Yeah.
So I'm going to sort of go into talking a little bit about the origin of Latino immigration to the Midwest, sort of looking at the foundation of these communities, and helping you all understand a little bit of what that looks like for Indiana and the Midwest more broadly. So the foundations of the Latino community in Indiana can be found in trading relationships that form between business and political leaders in northern Mexico and what is now the American Southwest, going back to the early 19th century. Santa Fe Trail played a large role in this, as it brought direct ties to the Midwest at its terminus in Missouri. Early Latino residents in the Midwest came to form partnerships with regional businesses, families like the Oteros, Valdez, and Armijos, as well as the Bents, St. Vrains, and Sellers, formed partnerships that transformed both the Midwest and communities in northern Mexico and the Southwest. Institutions were formed in the Midwest to foster this trade, including some of the earliest Mexican consulates in the region. In small numbers, groups of Mexicans and Mexican Americans made Indiana and other parts of the Midwest their home in the 19th century. It's important to note that this doesn't in a lot of ways mark the beginning of a real community. Residency was usually lived and not defined by strong cultural connections to the region. Moreover, the numbers were too small to form a critical mass in any given area. The motivation for this early immigration was, as I mentioned before, business relationships. It also came in the form of familial relationships, as often Latino business families were intermarrying with Anglo business leaders in the Midwest. The other key motivation was schooling. The Midwest had established Catholic universities like the University of Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana, or St. Louis University in Missouri, which were attractive to upper class Mexicans and their children. Great examples of this are the Oteros, Miguel Jr., pictured here, and his relative Adelino Otero, both of whom had major impacts on the history of New Mexico. They both attended school in the Midwest in the latter half of the 19th century, Miguel at St. Louis University and Adelina at Maryville College. We can go to the next slide. Another great example of this is Abraham Gonzales, who attended Notre Dame University and later served as a leader during the Mexican Revolution and governor of the Mexican state of Chihuahua. Notably, the Mexican Revolution marks an important shift in immigration to the Midwest, as larger numbers of immigrants began to arrive in the region in the 1910s. Mexican Revolution was an important push factor for immigrants to the Midwest and elsewhere in the United States, but there were huge pull factors that were going on. The largest one being the massive need for labor in the industrial Midwest. This came from a growing economy in the Midwest, as well as United States immigration law in the teens and in the early to mid 20s. We can go to the next slide. Those who came to the Midwest, to Indiana in particular, began to form community, as evidenced by this newspaper clipping discussing a celebration of Cinco de Mayo in Fort Wayne, Indiana in 1910. This is also a photograph of a Notre Dame student in his dorm room in 1911. Do you want to talk about this real quickly, Nicole?
Yeah. So this is the first documented Cinco de Mayo celebration in Indiana at Notre Dame in 1910. And so over the names that I have listed are the participants. And so these are men from wealthy families in Mexico who, one of them actually stayed in South Bend, but celebrating, giving, these great speeches about, the past, the present, and future of the Latino community and the importance of Cinco de Mayo. But if you notice in the headline, it is inappropriately attributed to as the Mexican 4th of July. And so Pedro de Landero, also known as Pete, actually, this is his yearbook photo in 1911, but he ended up staying on and became a professor at the University of Notre Dame, and so he taught Spanish. Next slide,
We can go to the next slide. So this is a great photograph. I don't know of any other photographs that exist quite like this. This is showing a boarding house in St. Louis in the 1920s. And it's significant as the migration to the Midwest was facilitated and promoted not just by government policy with guest worker programs, but also private recruitment agencies, names like the Model Employment Agency or the Griswold Employment Agency. And they would recruit workers and their families from northern Mexico and the American Southwest to come to the Midwest. And often their first place of arrival were boarding houses like this. And because it was, part of a journey, the beginning of a journey, perhaps, it wasn't necessarily something that a lot of families were documenting. But this is a photograph that I was able to find in someone's photo album in St. Louis that shows one of these boarding houses with these families out in front. And so it's a really great and rare sort of documentation of a part of the story of Latinos in the Midwest that we don't have a lot of documentation of. So I thought it was definitely worth sharing. We can go to the next slide.
So here, oh, there you go.
Okay, so I will conclude and say, ultimately the foundation of the community was created by workers, providing industrial labor for the Midwestern region. So this included railroad industry, like you have pictured here, steel mills, canning factories, and more. And Nicole's, I'm going to pass it on to her. She's going to explore how they built a community that was lasting and became far more than just Mexican. So we can go to the next slide.
So I'll give you just a snippet of the book, but historically, where are the largest populations of Indiana? That was the initial question that people asked while I was traveling the state. Next slides, please. So, but before that, especially in the book, we do a little bit map work. And I always, when I talk about presentations to folks throughout the state, I present something like this. So this is a 1847 map of Mexico and the United States. So prior to the Mexican-American War, and when the western half, the western third of the United States became Mexico. So, understanding, the Mexican border is fairly close to what was Indiana in 1816. So understanding the history of the United States and understanding also, again, with that map work, understanding the many different countries of Latin America. So that is a prominent feature in our book. Next slide. So where are these, historically in Indiana, where are these largest colonies? So they're definitely in two places. So in Lake County, in the northwest tip of Indiana is where I'm from. And then also Marion County in Indianapolis, where I currently live. And so there's no tie with that. There's no coincidence with that at all. But this is historically, when looking at the population and the history of Mexicans in the United States, in Indiana, these are the two areas. So the map here on our left is a 1928 map from a book called Mexican Labor in the United States. It is a series, it's a collection of books by Paul S. Taylor, who went from California all the way to Pennsylvania, examining the effects of this 1918 labor agreement between the United States and Mexico. And so that was the first time the United States called on Mexico and its laborers in the name of war relief. So it was during World War I. And so you see 5 different colonies. The 2 over here in the red box are East Chicago, Indiana, also known as Indiana Harbor. It goes by 2 names, and Gary, Indiana. Next slide, please. So this is one of the books that I've collected to build our collection. So we're going to look at first at the Indiana Harbor map. And so you notice that there are certain areas of the map that are a little bit darker than others and little bubbles with numbers in it. So the darker, it's a population density map. So you can see where the densest populations are by street level. And then also the numbers, the little bubbles are actually the number of school children. And so that report it covers everything from the environment, socioeconomics. It's just there are anonymous quotes in there from people of that community, and they interview laborers, they interview supervisors, labor agents, and so it's just great all the way around. And so you can see that the population formed an area what was commonly known as, which is now gone, Block and Pensy, short for Block and Pennsylvania Avenue. And so they literally formed outside of gate number 1 of Inland Steel Company. So Danny had talked about the need for labor in the industrial region or industrial areas of the Midwest. And so this is a great example of where the community formed right outside of one of the area's major employer. Next slide. This is a map of Gary, Indiana. And so you have different pockets here. There was also another steel mill company, what is now U.S. Steel Corporation. And so, but obviously this community did not form right outside of there, but so Gary's a little bit different. But Indiana Harbor, East Chicago, Indiana is really the historical epicenter of Latino history in the state of Indiana. Next slide. So Mexicans in the heartland. Next slide. So while doing some research, I really wanted to, people let people know that not all Latinos are Mexican. And so this is a great example of just that. So this is Miguel. He was born in Peru in 1891. And so this came in as a reference question to our archives, and it was passed along to me where I believe it's his granddaughter wanted, she was living in New York City. She wanted to know, how did my grandfather end up from, working on the Panama Canal to Gary? And so that was a little bit tough nut to crack, but I ended up figuring it out. But at this time, it was illegal to recruit foreign workers in foreign lands, but where the Panama Canal was a U.S. zone, and so it was illegal to recruit workers, steel workers, to work in places like Gary. And so U.S. Steel Corporation is also located in Pennsylvania and has many different subsidiaries, one of that being Portland Cement, which is produced by slag. Slag is a residue from or just a remnant from steel production. And so that's used to make things like glass, slag glass, and Portland cement. And so what I concluded is that the Portland cement and the steel was produced from U.S. Steel Corporation. And so that's how he made the jump from the Panama Canal to Gary, Indiana. So he died in 1955. He left a family behind in Panama that we do know. And so this is a really great example of how demographers in the early days in the 1920s and 30s, doing Mexican labor in the United States, where you have a large Spanish-speaking majority, but possibly a more diverse population ethnically within the Latino community. So this was a great example to illustrate in the book that not all Latinos are Mexican. And it was, yes, Mexican majority, but there were other people from Latin America as well. Next slide. So we are here with the Obreros group from 1925. This was a Catholic workers group that was formed in Indiana Harbor. And so this was part of a larger chapter, a larger network of workers groups, Catholic workers groups through the social Catholic movement, action movement that began in Latin America in the late 1800s. And so a chapter was established here. And so this was a mutual aid society. And so their motto is for God, for country, and for the worker. And so a lot of these men were of various education backgrounds, mostly came from the middle class. And so they came here initially as solos. They came by themselves. But by the time they formed in 1825, you would see a larger demographic shift to families. And so here is a photo of them on 4th of July. They are in front of a Romanian Catholic church because they were trying to start a church of their own. And so the priest there spoke Spanish. And so that's where they would celebrate their mass. And so this is on Butternut Street, I believe, in Indiana Harbor. And so the ways that they uplifted the working class was, providing different events. A lot of these ones were for different other entertainment groups, primarily a newspaper that started also in 1825. Next slide. And so this is the first Spanish language newspaper in the state of Indiana that was established by Francisco Figueroa. And here he is on the middle photo at the bottom, him and his wife, Consuelo. And so they settled on Theodore Street in Indiana Harbor and owned Figueroa Printers, which stayed in business until the 1980s. But since this was a men's group, only men served as writers, authors, contributors to this newspaper. And so here is the group of them in front of Our Lady of Guadalupe Church in the Black and Pensy neighborhood in the 1920s. And so Francisco, I think, is third from the right. So he's you can find him on any photo because usually he's one of the tallest people in a group photo. And so since Consuelo, she came from a hacienda owning family. She was educated. She followed her husband to Indiana Harbor shortly after they got married. He was there for a couple of years before he sent for her after they had their first child. And we have received documentation that even though she wasn't a part of the men's group or listed as the editorial staff, is that she was asked to review a lot of the content before the movable type was set for the newspaper. So she had her own business card for the print shop. So she was very much a valued member of this team. And so this newspaper ceased publication about 1931. Next slide. So other things that we collected, really establishing the history of the first Mexican Roman Catholic Church in the state of Indiana. This was started fundraising began in 1826, established in 1827. This photo that we just cropped, it's actually a funeral photo. Here are some parishioners in front of the first church. The building is now in its third iteration. And so here's a full-scale photo on the right. And then on the far left is a front copy for a ledger of accounts for one of the fundraising groups called the Apostleship of Prayer. And so the photo beneath that is the woman who collected all of these funds. And so she's collecting these funds from 1926, I think, until the early 1970s. And so this book is a really great example of female-led philanthropy and also for genealogical purposes. So you can see who is still here after the Depression and the repatriation movement. So it's a really great tool for a lot of things. And what I recently found out is that a lot of her reports that are in this book were also written in El Amigo newspaper. And so they would do weekly publications of who is giving what to the church. And so if you call that social pressure, donor list, it's just a really great example of the beginning of this church. Next slide. Also, businesses that had started in this area and still continue to exist today. One of them is El Popular, which is now known as a chorizo manufacturer in Northwest Indiana. Their offices still are in East Chicago. They began in 1925, and so here is a photo of its proprietor. In 1928, he is getting ready for the Fiestas Patrias parade, which is an annual Mexican Independence Day parade that was started in 1923 or 1924. It celebrates its 100th running this year. So here he is in front of his float. And so he initially started to sell Mexican chocolate and cheese, and then expanded out into different Mexican pantry staples like just beans, nopal, tortillas, and then they've scaled back their offerings quite a bit over the past century. So mostly known for Mexican chocolate and chorizo. And so it is the oldest operating Mexican-owned business in Indiana and also the Midwest. Next slide. Here is a bit clearer photo of their logo. So this is in the 1920s in a clipping from El Amigo del Hogar. And so he was also located on Deodore Street, actually in the same building where the Figueroa print shop was. So the Figueroa print shop also provided the printed paper that wrapped the chocolate and cheese. So they were all very tight-knit. Next slide. So Mexican repatriation in Indiana. So in the Midwest, it looked a little different than what we are taught in our history books. So in places like California and Texas and out west, they are largely known as very public and violent immigration raids. In Indiana, it looked a little bit different. So publicly, it was never called the repatriation movement. It was always known or advertised as a relief program. So sending all of these laborers back to Mexico. So it was more systemic than overt. And that by 1930, the total on the census, total population for the state for Mexican nationals was 9,642. 9,007 would be living in Lake County, both in Indiana Harbor and Gary. And so between just in the early days of repatriation, between 1930 and 1932, it was a 34% reduction in population. And so I did I write for our institutional blog at the Indiana Historical Society, and I did a pretty deep dive into a 2-part blog that really talks about how it was funded, how it was executed, and how did the people who stayed, like my family, persevere. So it was largely funded by the local industries, steel industries, large industries in Gary and Indiana Harbor. It was spearheaded by Judge Maurice E. Kreitz of East Chicago, and then also the Mexican consulate in Chicago. So there would also at this time be a Mexican consulate in Indiana, but was a more honorary, and it did end in 1931. And to my knowledge and research, that the Mexican consulate in Indianapolis was not affiliated with the Mexican repatriation movement in Northwest Indiana. Next slide. Danny?
So I'll add to what Nicole was saying about repatriation by noting that, repatriation was carried out by both public and private entities. I think it's important to sort of, take a look at this process. A lot of what was happening was that Mexican and Mexican Americans were finding employment really difficult. They were often the last to be hired and the first to be fired. And you see this sort of documented in Mexican consulate records. You can see how they talk about the challenges that this community was having. Of course, this is the Great Depression, so a lot of communities are having difficulty finding work. But the challenges facing the Mexican community were particularly acute. At the same time, you're looking at a public aid system that was excluding Mexican and Mexican Americans, making it very difficult to get any aid. So if you can't work and you can't get aid, it's going to be very difficult for you to have any other choice than to look at going somewhere else. At the same time, you've got public utilities like the railroads who are offering discounted rail fare for folks who will voluntarily, quote unquote, repatriate. So I think the experience of repatriation was painful. For those who made the journey, they were treated with harsh conditions. There are accounts of inadequate food being provided for children aboard. One, I think it's often reasons. One, I think it's often Westerners and perhaps those outside of the region as well. Two, it is had a huge impact on the Mexican community in Indiana. A lot of us, and the Midwest more broadly, a lot of estimates are that in certain places, the Mexican community was cut almost in half. And three, it played out slightly differently in Indiana than other parts of the Midwest, as Nicole mentioned. Most important part of this, perhaps, is that the community persevered after repatriation, continued to build, and the decades that followed would grow and thrive. And if we go to the next slide.
So what else is
Nicole, do you want to?
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
So what else is in the book? So we just covered a very small section of the book. The book covers 100 years of Latino history in Indiana. So we talk more about the diversity. So we add the history and contributions of people from other Latin American countries. We talk about 2 different Los Barrios of Indiana, both here in Indianapolis and in Chicago. Expanded statewide scope. Again, I did not focus all of my field work in Northwest Indiana. I traveled as far as Evansville, Indiana, which is right there at the bottom of the state, and everywhere in between. We talk about Latinos in politics and that the political arena and their contributions to the state. Farm workers in Indiana, we are an agricultural state, and so what did that look like? Also, Johnson's War on Poverty programs, the formation of AMIS, Associated Migrant Opportunity Services, Inc., a farm workers group that was headquartered in Indianapolis because we are the capital, but had offices throughout the state. Contributions to public health, living people here who are in Indianapolis who helped change that landscape. The 2006 immigration rally, which was for a long time, might still be one of the largest immigration rallies here in Indiana. And then we end in 2019, because again we were writing the book in 2020 and 2021, and that's where we end. Hola popular. Oh yeah. And so yeah, so I guess next slide. So overall, just talking about the culture and contributions of Latinos in Indiana.
So Nicole and I have been on this multi-year journey, sort of finding new avenues of documenting and telling the history of Latinos in Indiana. So what is the big so what of this? Why is it important? What we found is that the history of Latino communities has often not been a part of the broader story that Indiana tells about itself. Latinos are seen as new arrivals at times, and this erasure has consequences for Latinos in the state and those outside of the community. It means that some who don't fully understand the long history and impact of Latinos in Indiana may not put the appropriate value on the community's right to share in the collective decision making of what is happening in our state. For Latinos, particularly young people, I think it means they may not feel the pride that they should in what their ancestors have built and the legacy that they now carry. The work we're doing is dedicated to building toward a broader understanding of Latinos' true place in the story of Indiana. Do you want to add anything
So
on the end there?
I will. Danny talks about people, young people knowing their history. Again, my family has been. I grew up near Chicago, and I grew up in the next town over, but spent a significant amount of time in the harbor because both of my grandparents had lived there, and it really filled in. Like this hole or gap, this cultural displacement, even though I was born here, very, but I have this rich, deep cultural heritage, and I couldn't put my finger on it. I couldn't articulate it because it was not taught to me, but I did grow up around it, and so being able to write about this and put this together in a publication, I really hope that this book was meant for people who are not Latino and who want to understand this history in the state, and also people like myself who've been here for multiple generations, or for those who were born in different Latin American countries and are here and call Indiana home, to understand the wide contributions of all Latinos to the state of Indiana. And this is not a compendium of Latino history in Indiana. We're just merely scratching at the surface, and there's more research to be done. And we really hope that, since these have education guides and are geared towards high school classrooms in Indiana, that this is really a launch pad for future historians, and more research to be done and more to be added to the canon of Indiana history. Deborah Cantor, can you talk about some translation? The past 30 years. Well, we have a lot of people, like last 30 years, we have more people from Central America versus than Mexico here in Indiana in terms of contributing to the state. I'm trying to think of what's new. I feel like in the last couple of years here in the city of Indianapolis, we have our typical cultural celebrations. We have Fiesta, which is a pan-Latino festival that started in downtown Indianapolis in 1981, and it was the largest festival in the state of Indiana for a number of years. And just the explosion and the diversity of these different celebrations during Hispanic Heritage Month in September. It kicks off the second week of September, Fiesta does. But just to see that is amazing. Indianapolis once hosted the Pan Am Games in, I think, 1887. And so I think for a lot of folks who call Indiana home, really got to see the diversity of the Latino population here in Indianapolis. Different groups, different cultural groups, social groups were called on to be interpreters during that here. I think that's about 30 years ago. Probably about 30 years ago. So I don't know, it just continues to diversify, and the population has grown in a considerable amount, definitely in the last 30 years.
I think another thing I would add to that is sort of the political representation that Latinos as a political and cultural force has grown an incredible amount. Of course, we talk about Latino elected officials in Northwest Indiana that go back into the 60s, but on a broader statewide look, I think you're really looking at, not even the last 30 years, probably the last 10, 15 years, where you've seen sort of, a statewide impact, political impact of Latinos. And I think not just talking about elected officials, but also that broader ability to um, have institutions really considering Latino population as uh, like we're a force to be reckoned with, or an institute, a community that needs to be accounted for and has broader visibility as decisions are being made, as tables are being formed, as discussions are being had. And so I think that's a really, really positive thing that's happened.
Also, early politics being more skewed towards one political party than the other, and so we are seeing growth in both political parties here in Indiana in terms of representation at state offices and municipal levels as well.
We have a few questions coming in from Facebook.
Okay.
One question is, did LULAC have any influence in Indiana, or has LULAC been active in Indiana?
LULAC, and mostly in northern Indiana, the late and great Greg Chavez of South Bend, Indiana, was a really great activist in the northern part of the state. So LULAC, yes. The newspaper that I had talked about, so it ended in 1930, but the print shop still remained in the late 1950s. The Latin Times started, and so it was a bilingual newspaper, and really helped document like the Viva Kennedy movement. Also helped bring local politicians to make historical strides. So you see the first elected official in the 1950s, which is Joe Maravilla, to the East Chicago School Board. That changed after that. That became an appointed position. But then the first Latino city councilman, Jesse Gomez, in the 1960s. And so LULAC, a combination of just having a public voice and in their own newspaper, really helped with that.
Well, I want to hop back to something you just said. The first Latino elected official was on a school board, and then that became an appointed position. Yes. Was that because a Latino won the election?
I don't want to say if concretely if that is, but all arrows point to yes.
Wow. Okay.
Because in the 1950s is the first generation of living in Indiana Harbor of that the children of the immigrants that came there in the late 1910s and 1920s, and so they had more of a larger and collective and stronger voice in the 1950s, and so he was elected. Joe Maravilla was elected to the school board.
Wow.
So, okay. But now it's an appointed position, and I think it has now gone back in recent years to no longer an appointed position.
Okay. Well, we also have a question about what might be the oldest Mexican American social justice organization in Indiana.
I'm going to say the Obreros, the Mutual Aid Society. The collection of newspapers, we just received the original from the family, and so I had a chance to go through some of them. And so they were organizing protests. In the 1920s, there was a movie theater that Mexicans were not allowed to attend, and there was a number of them. I don't want to say which one, but I'll probably say the wrong one. But then they also said, you can only come in if you have one of the members of the Obreros groups with you. And so they were like, no. And so they ended up having their own theater in later years showing, Latino films, Spanish language films. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so you have evidence of them organizing protests in the 1920s. So I would say the Obreros group.
Another question. So go ahead.
I was going to say, I think there's a lot to unpack with these, mutual aid societies. They served a lot of functions. One of them was political, and we didn't, talk a lot about it in our talk, but there is, an incredible amount of importance that, was put in these mutual aid societies, both to help with folks who are coming, also to sort of, push a political advocacy, and also as educational institutions, particularly in the years that followed repatriation. You saw a lot of these organizations that became about educating the public or painting a particular view of Latino community for those outside of the community. And I think a lot of these, fiestas that were put on, or musical events, it's interesting, in the late 30s, in the 40s, you see these events becoming, um, events for the Latino community, definitely, but also being places where, they're inviting the broader community to come, because it is about cultural celebration, but also about sharing these, positive aspects of culture. And it really grows out of this desire for folks to understand, and seek inclusion, and you know I don't know, maybe some safety out of all of that.
Hmm.
So it's a political action as well as a party.
Mhm.
Danny, you mentioned pull factors, bringing people or attracting people to Indiana. One of our viewers has a question about any collaboration between Raza in Michigan, Illinois, and Wisconsin. I just know those states all kind of had similar pull factors. So this is a good question. What was there interaction between these groups of Latinos in these Midwestern states?
I would say I'll answer for you can pick up later. Chicago, is like a stone's throw from East Chicago, Indiana, and so you do see a lot of collaboration with those of South and the East side of Chicago, where also where the Mexican community was early Mexican community was formed. So you do see a lot of interaction that way. And Danny, I know you got something on the tip of your tongue, so.
I was going to say that I think, these communities are very connected, because in a lot of cases, you had populations that were highly mobile, that were moving between enclaves, sometimes seasonally. There were opportunities for work in the industrial Midwest in the 20s, 30s, 40s. There was a lot of labor to be had, and so folks were moving across these enclaves.
Mm,
You see, I interviewed a family that started in St. Louis and ended up, sort of, one by one moving to Indianapolis to work in canning factories there, and sort of, followed this path to try and find work that would provide an avenue toward a middle class lifestyle. And so, yeah, definitely these communities ended up being really connected in that
mhm,
way. Just by the nature of how folks were moving through the space, as well as, in a lot of cases, these recruiting agencies that we mentioned were, a built-in network. They were distributing workers across the Midwest, and so there were these natural ties across different regions for that reason as well.
Greg Chavez, who I mentioned, he was in his late 80s. Maybe even till his dying day, he was still very active in the Latino community. He grew up in southern Michigan, and his parents actually started an education fund there for Latino children, or college fund in southern Michigan. And so I think it's still active today. So again, Chicago, it's all they're all kind of smushed in there, and so it wasn't not too difficult to travel. Any other questions?
Two more. Okay.
Okay, okay.
There's just some commentary in here about Popular chocolate.
Oh yeah,
And
El Popular, yeah.
yeah, so Deborah says it's the first Mexican chocolate she tasted in Chicago
Hmm.
around 1970. So here in Texas, we have Popular chocolate too, but from Nuevo Leon. I'm just wondering, is there a connection between Popular chocolate from Nuevo Leon and this
I
Popular
don't
chocolate?
know. So VF Garza, who started it, was from Nuevo Leon, the state. So I know that he had started to work in Texas in the 1910s. I traced him through the census, and so I don't know. I mean, he started all kinds of businesses. So I would say maybe a loose tie, or maybe it's just a combination of the name as well. I mean, if you named your chocolate El Popular or La Popular, you'd have to try it, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. We
Yeah.
have to have a taste test.
Okay,
Okay.
let's do it. I'm game. Let's do it.
Okay. Okay. And I'm sorry. One of our teachers who's joining us has a couple of questions.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
One is there any evidence of any kind of third world solidarity with other minority groups between the Latinos in Indiana and others? And I just to add on to this question, when I think of Gary, Indiana, I definitely think about African Americans. It's like
Jackson 5. Yeah.
Jackson
Yeah,
5.
I mean, hard not to, right? When in terms of like solidarity, so due to like redlining and the next generation, the population of those kids in Indiana Harbor, when they started to have families of their own, they could not rent or buy houses in certain areas of Chicago. And at that time, there were parts of Gary that were still had like available land. Like I know that my grandfather moved to the Brunswick area of Gary in I think in the maybe late 50s, early 60s, he built a house. They ended up, he and my grandmother ended up having 6 children. But, during white flight, they moved back to the Indiana Harbor. My grandmother is from Mexico, and so she didn't speak much English. She couldn't drive. And so they moved back to the harbor so she can, walk to the local, Main Street, Broadway, to the stores there. And then also to have other Spanish speaking wives who lived on her block to talk to. So in terms of that, I think before I like end off like in a tangent and get lost somewhere, I'll just keep my answer right there. Danny?
I don't know that I have a good example, but Nicole, what about the church in Northwest Indiana?
Yeah, so the church, Our Lady of
connection.
Guadalupe Church. I mean, that place
Yeah.
was like it kept the community together during the Depression. They started their own elementary school at one time. So there were many different East Chicago was like the city of churches and immigrants. I think there, like every mile and a half, there was a church of a different ethnicity, Orthodox, Christian, or Catholic. And so you had like 3 Holy Ghosts. One was Greek Orthodox, one was Romanian, and one was like Slovakian. But Our Lady of Guadalupe Church was the Mexican Roman Catholic Church, and so it was like a meeting place, place of where people like gathered, right? It clothed and fed the population during the 1930s, when again they weren't eligible for the social relief rolls in the 1920s or other available charities to them. So I think yeah.
Okay, and then just last question, and I'm not sure how much comparative work you've done, but the question is opportunities for accessing education in Indiana for Latinos or for Mexican Americans compared to other places like in the Southwest where children of Mexican descent attended segregated schools.
So I would say, like in the Catholic schools, yes, like they created their own church, but in terms, it was actually one floor of a Polish parish school. It was empty. It was emptied out, and so they kind of shared that building. In terms of like education, I know that the city of Hammond, which has also increasingly become Latino, present day Latino, has, if you live there, I think it's called College Bound, in which you can go to college for free. I'm sure there's like certain limitations with that, and so I think that's attractive to live up in that city, which is like next door to East Chicago. And there's a lot of different funds, education funds that provide scholarships to East Chicago students presently. I'm thinking about present day stuff. So, yeah. And then different, it's no longer Inland Steel. It's now Cleveland Cliffs, the steel mill. And so they provided a large amount of scholarships to that area. So I don't know if that necessarily answers the question, but in terms of access to, I think about funds and the ability to afford to go to college. And so that's what I think of in terms of access to education.
Mm-hmm. And certainly today, I think that, at least from my perspective as a Texan, when I think of Indiana, I definitely think of Notre Dame.
Yeah.
As Danny mentioned earlier, there has been such a pipeline
Oh, yeah.
for Mexican Americans to go to Notre Dame.
And in Indianapolis, we have dental
Mhm.
schools, medical schools. And so, before 1918, that's who you really see is young men and some women from wealthy families coming to Indianapolis. I found a 1916 Indianapolis article said 100 Mexicans live in Indianapolis. And so like, what's this about? And so I don't really find traceable communities until like the 1930s and 40s. But I'm like, what's this in 1916? Well, a lot of them were attending our medical schools and our dental. We have, different medical schools here in the city. And because of that and a wide variety of other kind of political factors, Russell B. Harrison, the son of U.S. President Benjamin Harrison, was appointed by Porfirio Diaz as on an honorary consulate, which operated from 1907 to recently, I just found out, to 1931. So not like a typical standard. It was more for economic and political reasons, but I can talk about that later. But yeah, so I mean, Latinos have been here, right? And so we've just not been talked about publicly in publications and whatnot. So now people know the secret.
The secret is out. Yes.
The secret's out. Everybody knows. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. Oh, go ahead, Danny.
Well, I was just going to say, I think those educational ties, it's important to note that they weren't an accident, right? There were, active efforts on the part of Mexican and Mexican Americans in the Midwest going and working with the Diaz regime to make that pipeline occur. So it was a very intentional, sort of planned thing.
Oh, I see. We've got a question from Kelly. Speaking of Notre Dame, what was the Cinco de Mayo tie to South Bend? That area, Notre Dame, previous slides, was the first documented place where the first public Cinco de Mayo, not influenced by beer marketing or beer culture, was celebrated in Indiana in 1910.
Well, this is just amazing history. Thank you so much for the work you've done to document the history of Latinos in Indiana. I'll have to see if maybe one day we can get that traveling exhibit done here.
Yes.
Yes. I want to thank everyone who tuned in tonight. Thank you for joining us. Of course, I want to thank our funders, including the City of San Antonio, Bexar County, the Mellon Foundation, the John L. Santikos Fund of the San Antonio Area Foundation, AARP, Wells Fargo, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, the Texas Historical Foundation, and individual donors like you. Thank you. If you like tonight's presentation, we have more events coming up. In fact, let me just show you real quick what's happening next. If you're here in San Antonio, please join us at the Guadalupe Latino Bookstore for a tardeada with Juan Tejeda, who will be presenting on his new book, Mi Carnal Frank, which is a memoir or biography of his late brother, U.S. Congressman Frank Mariano Tejeda. We'll have a book talk, a signing, and a musical performance from Juan and Armando. And we'd love to see you there. And for those of you who join us virtually, our next virtual talk will be on March 12th, when we welcome Dr. Lauren Araiza for a talk about the Black freedom struggle and the United Farm Workers. This will be about a week before the annual Cesar Chavez March here in San Antonio. So it's your opportunity to get fired up for the annual Cesar Chavez March and an opportunity to learn about intersections between Black and Brown labor activism. I encourage you to learn more about MACRI at somosmacri.org, where you can find our complete list of upcoming programs and everything that we're up to. So thank you again, Nicole and Donnie. It was such a pleasure to chat with you tonight.
Thank you
so much.
Gracias and good night, everyone.